The last snow of winter still clung to the edges of the Bitter Ridge forest, where towering evergreens swayed in the hush of a new morning. Caleb Walker, a man carved from solitude and silence, stood outside his cabin, the scent of pine and thawing earth stirring in the air. 9 years had passed since fire had swallowed the life he once knew his wife, his child, his dreams all buried beneath the ash and the years that followed. He hadn't spoken more than a few words a week since then, nor seen another soul outside of the occasional passing deer or circling hawk. But this morning was different. Near the fence that bordered his land, something white caught his eye. It wasn't snow. It was a dress, a wedding dress, soaked in mud, torn at the hem, its train caught on a split fence post. A woman lay slumped there, her wrists bound with coarse rope skin, pale face, bruised hair, tangled and dark. Caleb's chest tightened, not with fear but something heavier, something long buried. Axe still in hand from morning firewood chores, he stepped closer. Her eyes fluttered open, blue wide and glassy with confusion. He didn't wait. With one swift swing, he severed the rope around her wrists. "You in trouble, miss?" he asked gently, kneeling beside her. No answer. She blinked slowly, looking around but not speaking. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came. He offered a hand. "Can you walk?" She hesitated, then reached for him with trembling fingers. Her body was colder than the snow, still hiding in the shadows. As he helped her stand, something fell from her hand, a scrap of damp paper, barely legible. Caleb unfolded it carefully. The ink had run, but one line was still clear. For Caleb Walker. No name, no return address. Just that. It was either a warning, a plea, or a cruel trick. Without another word, he lifted her in his arms and carried her to his cabin. Inside, the fire had died down to coals. He laid her on a thick blanket near the hearth, relit the fire, and gently unwrapped the rest of the rope from her wrists and ankles. She didn't resist, just lay still, breath slow and uneven. He wrapped her in his wool coat and an extra blanket, then poured a tin mug of warm water and set down a slice of bread and a sliver of aged cheese. She didn't touch the food. He scribbled a note on a piece of scrap paper and slid it in front of her. "It's safe here. Do you need help to speak?" She stared at the message hands, trembling as they grazed the paper, but gave no reply. Her lips pressed into a flat line, her shoulders shrinking into the blanket. Caleb nodded once and didn't press further. Outside, he followed the wagon tracks that led away from his gate and vanished into the woods. Whoever had left her here had come deliberately. They hadn't tried to hide the trail, but the snow was melting fast soon. Any sign of the carriage or driver would be gone. Back inside, she had curled tightly beneath the blanket. Her breathing had steadied. He watched her, silently anger simmering low in his gut, not at her, but at whoever had done this. Someone had chosen his land, his name, and his life as a dumping ground. But this woman, she wasn't trash to be discarded. He sat beside the fire, not as a rescuer, but as a witness. He didn't know her story yet, but one thing was clear: she was not going to be left behind again. Caleb made a vow, unspoken but firm. Whatever storm had brought her here, he would not let it sweep her away again. Later that night, the cabin fell into quiet again. The fire crackled gently, and the wind outside whispered through the cracks in the wood. He sat on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in a spare blanket, his axe now leaning harmlessly against the wall. Sleep didn't come. His mind traced back through every step that led to this day. The last time he had carried someone across that threshold, it had been his wife, heavy with smoke and lifeless in his arms. That memory still haunted the air like smoke on old timber. And yet tonight, that memory felt a little less sharp, a little less suffocating. He glanced toward the bedroom, the one he hadn't entered in nearly a decade. It held more ghosts than warmth. But when he opened the door softly, he found himself standing on the threshold again. There, beneath the pale quilt and the faint smell of cedar, lay the woman. Her face finally relaxed, her bruises less angry in the firelight. He adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. She shifted slightly, but didn't wake. When he returned to the living room, he laid his own bedding on the floor close enough to hear if she stirred far enough to give her space. The wind rattled the broken window frame above him, and he rose lantern in hand to wedge a bit of cloth into the draught. Outside, the moon hung low, and the forest stretched wide and cold. He had spent 9 years trying to disappear from the world. But now, with a silent stranger sleeping in his bed, it felt like the world had followed him anyway, and left her on his doorstep as proof. A sliver of old wisdom crossed his mind, something his father used to say. Sometimes the forest sends you what you need not, what you want. And as Caleb sat back down beside the fire, eyes heavy and heart unsettled, he didn't know yet whether this woman was a gift, a test, or a storm. But he knew one thing for certain. She would not sleep in fear again, not under his roof. He closed his eyes to the soft crackle of the fire and the first true silence he had known in years. The next morning arrived slowly, with soft shafts of light creeping through the cracks in the shutters. Caleb stirred first, rising from his pallet on the floor with a quiet groan. His muscles ached from a night spent on cold planks, but he moved with the ease of a man used to discomfort. He stoked the fire, back to life, added fresh water to the kettle, and turned toward the bedroom. The door remained closed, but he could hear faint movement within. That alone was enough. She was awake. He stepped out quietly, giving her space, and went to mend the loose window frame on the east wall. The wind had battered the sill, and snowmelt dripped steadily into a warped pan beneath it. The hammer in his calloused hand felt familiar grounding. When he returned, she was sitting up in bed, the blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes found him cautious but no longer wild. Still, she said nothing. He didn't expect her to. Caleb set down a tray on the nearby stool, fresh water, warm porridge, and a slice of baked apple he'd prepared from his winter stores. This time, she accepted the food. Progress. Caleb wrote a single word on a scrap of paper and slid it across the quilt. Name. She hesitated. Then, slowly trembling slightly, she took the pencil from his hand. Her script was delicate, as though unused for a long while. When she passed it back, the answer was written in gentle strokes. Elsie. He nodded, once folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket like something sacred. Later that afternoon, as he repaired the fence post where she'd been found, Caleb paused and carved 2 words into the new board, safe here. The forest echoed with the gentle hush of thawing snow, the occasional caw of a raven, and his steady hammering. He didn't ask where she came from, didn't ask what she'd been running from. But he'd seen bruises like those before on war refugees, on battered wives, on people the world tried to silence. He was beginning to understand. That night, long after the fire had dimmed and silence settled over the cabin, something unexpected happened. It began, faintly, a sound so soft it might have been the wind. Caleb, half asleep by the hearth, opened his eyes and held his breath. It was music. A voice, low and haunting, rose from the bedroom. He stood slowly. The door creaked as he opened it, just wide enough to peer inside. Elsie sat by the window wrapped in his flannel coat. Her head was tilted upward, her eyes closed, and from her parted lips came a melody like nothing he'd ever heard. It wasn't in English. Maybe not even in words. just sound aching beautiful, filled with longing. Notes floated on the air like fireflies. Her hands moved in small rhythmic patterns, fingers dancing in time with the song. It was a lament, he realized. A song for what had been lost, for what had never been said. Caleb didn't move, afraid that a single step might shatter the fragile moment. But Elsie must have sensed him. Her song faltered. She turned sharply, eyes wide, breath caught. Panic flashed across her face. Her lips moved as if trying to explain, but no words came. Her body curled inward, defensive as though expecting a blow. Caleb stepped forward slowly, holding out both hands, palms open. "It's okay," he whispered. "Don't stop." His voice sounded foreign to him, rough and quiet, but it steadied her. The fear in her eyes melted just slightly. She studied him for a moment, then, with trembling resolve, began to sing again. This time it was softer, slower, like the first raindrops after a drought. He sat on the floor, just inside the doorway, listening with reverence. The fire's glow painted her features gold, and the sadness in her voice gave way to something else, hope, maybe. Courage. For a woman who hadn't spoken since arriving, this song was a declaration, a reclaiming of something long buried. When she finished, the last note hovered in the air before dissolving into silence. She didn't speak. She just stood and walked past him into the hallway, leaving the door open behind her. In the quiet that followed, Caleb sat motionless, heart pounding. That voice, her voice, had shattered the stillness of the cabin in a way no wind or storm ever could. It wasn't just music. It was a truth. The next morning, she was gone from the kitchen. But on the table lay a folded note. "Please, don't tell anyone I can speak." He stood with the paper in hand, turning it over like it might vanish if he blinked. Then, without hesitation, he walked to the mantel. There, next to the old photograph of his late wife, he placed the note beneath the frame like a vow. He would protect it. He would protect her. Elsie's voice wasn't just a secret, it was a wound, one that needed more than safety. It needed shelter. Outside, the wind picked up. Birds called across the forest, and in the distance a thin column of smoke rose from a neighbor's chimney. Caleb Walker, once a ghost of the forest, now stood at the edge of something fragile and new. He didn't know what Elsie had escaped or why fate had dropped her at his doorstep. But he knew one thing: she had sung, and that meant she hadn't given up, and he wouldn't either. Word travels fast in small towns, faster still when whispered behind cupped hands and twitching curtains. Ember Ridge wasn't a large town, but it was nosy, suspicious of outsiders, and quick to piece together stories with or without facts. When Caleb Walker sent a marriage certificate to the county courthouse, it was only meant to protect Elsie on paper at least. The way he saw it, if anyone ever came looking for her, it might be safer if she wasn't legally alone. She hadn't objected when he showed her the form, just nodded silently, eyes clouded with something unreadable. But then came Vernon Clay, a name Caleb hadn't heard in nearly a decade. The same man who once lit the fire that took everything from him, accidentally they claimed, though Caleb had never been convinced. Vernon had been jealous, bitter, a troublemaker who vanished after the fire, only to return now like smoke curling under a closed door. Vernon saw the document, and he saw an opportunity. The whispers began at the church steps first. Caleb's hiding a woman in his cabin. Then at the general store. "I heard she doesn't talk. Real pretty, too. Maybe he bought her." And, finally, around the potbelly stove at the feed store. "She's wearing a wedding band but never been seen in town. Seems mighty suspicious, don't it?" By the end of the week, people weren't just whispering. They were looking sideways at Caleb when he came into town for supplies. Vernon fanned the flames with oily charm, presenting himself as a concerned citizen. "I just want what's best for the girl," he told the sheriff with a tight smile. "That man lives in the woods. Can't be right in the head. Now he's calling some stranger his wife." Caleb didn't argue. He had learned long ago that truth doesn't shout, it endures. Still, he began chopping more wood than usual, not just for the cabin, but because it helped clear the ache in his chest. Elsie noticed the change in him. She said nothing. But one morning, when he left a small carving of a bird on her nightstand, he found a folded napkin waiting for him in return. On it, she'd drawn a single line of music notes, a fragment of the song she'd sung. Beneath it, she'd written 2 words, "I'm staying." But staying became dangerous. It started with a bounty hunter, a thick-jawed man named Brant, who rode into town with a rifle slung across his shoulder and Vernon Clay's name in his pocket. He sniffed around town asking questions, always starting casual, then getting sharper. One night, Brant showed up at Caleb's cabin under the pretense of buying firewood. Elsie was inside out of view. Caleb met him at the porch axe in hand, the tension between them as crisp as frost. "Just need some kindling," Brant said, peering past him. "Heard you got extra." Caleb didn't blink. "I keep enough for winter, not for wandering mouths." They stared at each other for a moment too long before Brant nodded and rode off, but Caleb knew it was far from over. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did Elsie. Then came the town summons, a courthouse notice nailed to the cabin gate. Caleb Walker was to appear and explain the circumstances of his so-called marriage. No lawyer, no hearing request, just a demand. And tied beneath it was a second slip of paper. "She's not yours." The note bore Vernon's handwriting. Caleb's hands shook as he crumpled it. He had faced bears, wildfires, and blizzards, but nothing prepared him for the feeling of helplessness that came with trying to protect something so fragile. Elsie stood behind him, watching. She stepped forward, hand on his arm. It was the first time she'd reached for him unprompted. Her fingers curled around his sleeve, and when he looked at her, she nodded once. No words, no smile. Just trust. The day of the courthouse hearing arrived under a low sky. Clouds hung thick over Ember Ridge, and the streets buzzed with murmurs. Curious neighbors and judgmental eyes filled the wooden benches inside the room. Vernon stood near the judge's bench, all mock humility and false concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Caleb Walker isn't just grieving. He's unwell, and this woman who cannot speak has no way to say what he's done to her." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. The sheriff, uncomfortable but bound by duty, stood by. Elsie sat at the center of the room, wrists bound loosely, head bowed. Her silence fed the accusations. No one asked her to speak. No one gave her a chance. Not until Caleb stepped forward and said she was left at my gate. Bound, hurt, I gave her shelter. That's all. Then why the license? The judge snapped. I wanted her to be safe. From men like him. Caleb nodded at Vernon, whose smirk cracked slightly. The judge frowned, and Vernon held up the license. "This proves she belongs to him." Caleb's fists clenched. Elsie's hand shook. The room teetered toward a verdict built on silence, fear, and forged documents. And then something happened. A sound rose. Soft, pure. Elsie inhaled. Her fingers brushed her throat, searching for courage. And then she began to sing. The same song from the cabin. Her voice rang out fragile at first, then stronger, a storm turned sunrise. She sang of captivity and flight, of hidden pain and stolen names. Every note peeled away doubt like bark from a rotted tree. The entire room stilled. Vernon's face paled. The judge leaned forward, hand frozen above the gavel. Even the sheriff's eyes glistened. Elsie's final note broke like sunlight through smoke. And just like that, the silence no longer belonged to Vernon Clay. The courtroom sat suspended in silence, the last note of Elsie's song still echoing in the dust-drenched beams above. People stared, some in awe, others in disbelief, as if sound itself had betrayed their assumptions. For a woman rumored to be mute, her voice was nothing short of a miracle. It wasn't just that she sang, it was that her song told a story no one had dared to ask her for. Judge Merrill, a stoic man, known more for his frowns than his feelings, looked visibly shaken. He lowered his gavel slowly, his mouth parting, but no words coming at first. This is no abduction, he said finally, his voice oddly tender. This young woman has not been stolen, she's been silenced. And today she reclaimed what was hers. Vernon Clay, red-faced and gaping, waved the marriage license again. That doesn't change the fact it's forged. She never signed it. He's lying. The judge looked over the document more closely this time. These signatures don't match, he said with a narrowed gaze. Nor do the dates. He glanced at Elsie. Miss, do you wish to remain with Mr. Walker? Elsie met Caleb's eyes across the courtroom. Her hands rose slowly, not to shield, not to tremble, but to sign. Each movement was clean, graceful, deliberate. Yes, she signed, he is my home. A woman in the back let out a gasp. The sheriff finally stepped forward, looking from Vernon to the judge. Permission to investigate the license source, Your Honor. Might be worth seeing who filed it. Granted, Judge Merrill said without hesitation, and released the girl. The deputy at her side cut her bindings. Elsie rubbed her wrists red and raw. Caleb moved to her, slowly unsure if it was his place. She met him halfway. The moment they touched her hand in his, it was as if the room exhaled together. A quiet wave of understanding passed through the crowd. Vernon tried one last time. She's lying. She's putting on a show. But no one listened. The judge banged the gavel. Mr. Clay, you will sit. This hearing is concluded. The license is null and void. Caleb Walker is cleared of all charges. Caleb turned eyes full of something he hadn't dared feel in years. Elsie didn't smile, but she nodded once firmly. The room watched them walk out together, hand in hand. Outside, the town of Ember Ridge was different. The air was the same, the streets unchanged, but people looked at them with something new in their eyes. Not suspicion, not pity. Respect, not everyone, of course. There were still those who clung to gossip like children to blankets, but they whispered a little quieter now. And when they passed Caleb in the square, most men nodded. A few women even reached for Elsie's hand. Later that evening, the cabin smelled of cedar and tea. A low fire danced in the hearth, and the wind tapped softly at the windows. Caleb sat on the porch, whittling a feather from pine. It wasn't much, just something to give his hands purpose. Elsie stepped out quietly and sat beside him. He handed her the carving without a word. She turned it over in her palm, then tapped it against her heart and laid it on the porch rail. Then she leaned her head gently on his shoulder. For the first time in a long time, he didn't flinch. For a while, they said nothing. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they didn't need to. In the days that followed, Caleb returned to chopping wood, mending fence posts, and gathering eggs from the hens that had survived the cold. Elsie joined him quietly. She began tending to the garden out back, pulling weeds and planting hardy spring seeds. They moved like people who had shared pain, not through stories, but through silence that was understood. But peace doesn't come without consequence. Despite the courtroom decision, some in Ember Ridge still believed Vernon Clay. Or at least they feared him enough to pretend he might be right. One night, Caleb came home to find a dead fox nailed to his gate. a crude message carved into the wood beside it. "You don't belong." He burned it without a word. Elsie saw the smoke, but didn't ask. Instead, she pulled out a folded napkin later that night and placed it beside his plate at dinner. On it, a single line of music just like before. This time, she'd added words beneath it. "They don't have to believe us, just each other." And still, the unease lingered. Caleb knew Vernon wouldn't go quietly. Men like him never did. They couldn't stand being proven wrong, especially not by a woman's voice. Sure enough, the sheriff appeared 3 days later with an apology in his eyes and a warrant in his hand. "I'm sorry, Caleb," he muttered. "Judge says we gotta hold you overnight. Apparently, there's new evidence." It was a formality, a political move to keep the townsfolk settled. But it felt like betrayal. Caleb went without protest. Elsie followed them to the jailhouse but wasn't allowed inside. The iron bars clanged shut behind him and he sat alone in a cell barely larger than his woodshed. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge. Cold seeped in, and then she sang. Just outside the barred window, her voice rose like a flag in the wind, soft, steady, and sure. Her melody curled into the cracks of the jail, warmed the stale air, and settled over his shoulders like a blanket. The deputies paused in the hallway. Town folks stopped as they passed. Some wept, some smiled, and for Caleb, behind steel and stone, the song was not a cry for justice, it was a promise. That even when walls stood between them, she would still reach him. With every note, she tore down what Vernon tried to build. And with every sunrise after she returned to sing again. The jailhouse in Ember Ridge had never seen such mornings. For 9 consecutive days before the sun even touched the church steeple, Elsie appeared with her small wooden stool and a folded page of lyrics in her coat pocket. She would sit just beyond the barred window of Caleb's cell, her voice rising through the still air, transforming silence into sanctuary. Each morning, more townspeople gathered, not in protest or pity, but in reverence. A baker would pause with flour still on his apron. The blacksmith leaned his hammer against the anvil. Mothers held their children's hands and whispered, "Listen." The most remarkable of them was a boy named Emmett, no older than 12, who brought his deaf younger sister each morning. Elsie would take the girl's tiny hands and move them gently in time with the song, guiding her through each note with sign. It wasn't just about hearing anymore. It was about feeling the music, and the town began to feel it too. Even Sheriff Dugan, a man carved from oak and routine, stood straighter when Elsie sang. "Don't know what it is," he admitted one morning, "but it makes everything quieter afterward. Like the noise in your head finally shuts up." Inside the cell, Caleb listened. Not to the notes he had memorized those, but to the world changing outside his walls. For the first time since the fire, he felt connected again, not just to a person, but to a place. Yet not all hearts shifted so easily. Vernon Clay had grown quieter since the courtroom loss, but not idle. He paced back alleys and whispered in shadowy corners. His pride was a wounded beast desperate to strike. The judge's dismissal had embarrassed him, but worse, it had empowered Elsie. Her voice, once hidden, once silenced, had become her weapon, and it was drawing the town away from his influence. But he wasn't ready to let go. On the 9th day of Caleb's confinement, a stranger appeared, a slight woman in mourning black with silver in her hair and determination in her step. She stood at the jailhouse square, a leather-bound book clutched tightly in her arms. "I am Mrs. Greer," she announced, her voice as steady as stone. "I once worked in the Clay household." People turned. The sheriff stepped forward. "I know what Vernon did," she continued. "I heard him threaten that girl. I saw the fear in her eyes and the blood in her hair. Her fingers opened the book to a page with neat, deliberate handwriting names, dates, details. I kept records of things no one was supposed to see, because I was afraid. But no more. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She handed the book to the sheriff, her eyes never leaving his. If you want the truth, it's all in here. Inside the jail, the clatter of keys was sudden and jarring. The deputy unlocked Caleb's cell and opened the door. "You're free," he said. "There's been a witness, an affidavit. Everything's changed." Caleb stepped into the light like a man waking from stone. His first sight was Elsie, standing in the crowd, her eyes wide and wet. Beside her, the deaf girl signed something eagerly, and Emmett beamed. He crossed the square slowly, unsure if he was walking into reality or a dream. But when Elsie stepped forward and took his hand, just took it firmly and without hesitation, he knew it was real. The crowd parted. There was no applause, no fanfare. Just murmurs of thank you and we were wrong and one soft welcome home. Caleb knelt and scooped the little girl into his arms. She giggled and slipped a folded paper into his palm. It was the same song Elsie had taught her. He turned to Elsie. Her lips moved silently. "Let's go home." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the last light scattered across the treetops, Caleb hammered a new sign into the soft earth at the edge of their garden. He had carved it himself. Caleb and Elsie's place. No more silence, just music. The cabin had changed. Wildflowers now lined the walkway. The porch was no longer empty. It was a place for friends, children, and neighbors who stopped by not out of curiosity but out of care. Mrs. Greer arrived with a loaf of warm bread still dusted in flour. The baker's wife brought preserves. A carpenter helped repair the sagging barn roof. Even Sheriff Dugan sat on the porch steps one evening, sipping coffee and listening to the children's laughter. Elsie spent her days teaching. Not just music, but expression. She showed children how to speak through signs, how to move in rhythm, how to be heard without making a sound. Her fingers had become their language. One evening, as the lanterns flickered to life and the air filled with fiddle tunes and whispered stories, Caleb sat with a plank of cedar balanced across his knees. He carved the same words again, smaller this time, and planted them at the porch edge where wild thyme grew. "You are safe here." Later that night, when the porch was quiet again, Elsie stepped into the middle of the gathering. She raised her hand, took a breath, and sang once more. It was her courtroom song, but transformed. No longer a cry of pain, it was now an anthem of joy. Her voice soared beneath the stars, strong and unafraid. The children clapped. Neighbors smiled. Caleb stood nearby, eyes never leaving her. When she finished, he stepped forward, dropped to one knee, and slid a silver band onto her finger. She gasped softly, then did the same. Their hands trembled, but not with fear, with release, with love. And when they looked to the crowd, no one asked for words. They didn't need to. In Ember Ridge, their silence had been rewritten into song. A full year had passed since the morning Caleb Walker found Elsie tied to his fence, half frozen, dressed in a torn wedding gown with fear in her eyes. That chapter, once heavy with silence and shadow, had given way to something no one in Ember Ridge had quite expected: music. The cabin, once a place of grief and retreat, had come alive. Caleb had painted the door a cheerful forest green. Elsie's garden bloomed in tidy rows beside the porch, rich with lavender cornflowers and basil. The scent of damp soil and honeyed sun drifted through open windows. Wind chimes tinkled softly above the doorway, handmade from carved pine and old spoons. The carved sign still stood by the path. Caleb and Elsie's place. No more silence, just music. Children gathered daily under the cabin's eaves, some hearing, some not. Elsie knelt in the grass among them, patient and graceful, teaching songs with her hands. They moved their fingers in rhythm, gesturing verse, shaping harmony in the air like invisible ribbons. Her students watched her lips closely, her hands even more. Some of them couldn't hear a single note, but they felt everything. Elsie had taught them how. Inside, Caleb worked steadily, chopping wood, repairing tools, fixing fences for neighbors who once doubted him. He had regained his place in the town, not by force or argument, but by being the man he always was, quiet, dependable, unshakable. Now that strength had a purpose again. He whistled as he worked his melody, always faintly following the tempo of laughter and signed songs from the yard. That afternoon, the townsfolk returned not for court, not for rumors, but for a celebration. The spring festival. It had been decades since the town had hosted one. After the fire that changed Caleb's life, the annual event had been quietly dropped from the calendar. Too many memories, too much sorrow. But not this year. The square, brimmed with color, bunting hung between lamp posts and booths, overflowed with hand-carved toys, home-baked pies, wildflower crowns, and bundles of sage. The aroma of grilled meat mixed with sweet cider and pine sap. Fiddles played lively reels as kids darted through crowds, faces sticky with jam and joy. In the center of it all stood a simple wooden stage draped with ribbons and wild daisies. Elsie stepped onto it, slowly dressed in a pale yellow dress that shimmered with the movement of every breeze. She didn't need a microphone. She didn't even need to speak. The crowd hushed the moment she raised her hands. She signed, first slow and deliberate. I never wanted to be heard, she gestured. I only wanted not to be hurt. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Many were hearing these words for the first time, not spoken, but through the purest clarity of gesture. Her voice, when it followed, was soft but steady. My silence was my shield, she said, but music was always inside me. She paused, letting her truth breathe in the air. Caleb helped me see that words spoken or signed can be safe. Across the square, he stood still, eyes locked on her. The children sat cross-legged near the stage watching with wide eyes. Then came the song, the one she had once sung behind closed doors and later behind iron bars. But now it belonged to the town. To every heart she had softened every barrier she had melted. No cage for my wings, no lock on my soul. Her voice wrapped around the people like a blanket. It was no longer about suffering. It was a song of rebirth, of trust rebuilt of fear shed like an old coat. As her final note floated into the warm sky, Caleb stepped forward and climbed the stage steps. He didn't speak either. He didn't need to. He simply held out his hand. Elsie took it. The crowd didn't cheer. At first, they stood in still reverence. Some cried, some clapped. And then the cheer grew not wild, not chaotic, but warm, whole. An elderly woman stepped forward, the same who once watched from her porch with skeptical eyes. She placed a wreath of daisies in Elsie's hair and whispered, "Welcome home, child." They walked through the square together, hand in hand. Every step was a quiet promise. Every glance from their neighbors a new kind of blessing. A little girl in the crowd, a deaf girl who had learned to sign through Elsie's songs, looked up at her mother and signed excitedly. She said words. Later, at twilight, the porch filled with neighbors. The air buzzed with fiddle tunes and clinking teacups. Elsie stood in the center again, surrounded by townspeople who once questioned her right to exist among them. And again she sang. Her final song was simple. It wasn't about escape. It wasn't about pain. It was about now. About this life shaped not by silence but by choice. When the last note faded, Caleb knelt before her and slid a second ring onto her finger. This time, no courtroom, no license, just two people in front of the ones who finally saw them. She returned the gesture, slipping a band over his calloused hand. The porch glowed with lantern light. Children clapped, some in rhythm, some in sign. There were no speeches, just smiles, embraces, and music, the kind that reached places no voice ever could. As the night deepened, Elsie leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder. They looked out over the town, their town now. In that moment, Ember Ridge became more than a place. It became a testament that people can change, that voices long buried can rise, that silence can be strength, and that love, when true, doesn't always need words. Sometimes the loudest acts of bravery are the quietest ones. Not everyone who's been silenced is broken. Some are simply waiting for someone to listen not to their voice, but to their truth. Caleb and Elsie's story reminds us that healing doesn't always come through noise. Sometimes it comes in a whispered song, a carved fence post, or a hand quietly held in the dark. If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances and found families and the kind of love that rewrites the past, leave us a comment below. Would you have untied her? And if you're still holding on to someone else's silence, maybe it's time to let it sing. Subscribe for more true-hearted stories like this. Until next time, walk steady love deeply and always listen closely.